Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. So we are talking about a born warrior with a fondness for killing with a bow and arrow and a price on his head. Those are some of the widely held views about Anders Lassen. Thomas Harder, author of fabulous biography, will actually set the record straight about this remarkable Dane who actually didn't spend a huge amount of time of his life in Denmark. But I can't wait to bring it. I'm sure Thomas was that when I was saying the bow and arrow, but he was going, "Oh no!" But I was doing it to say it was wrong. Good evening, Thomas. How are you today?
Good evening. Thanks. Fine. I've been looking forward to this.
Me too. So the thing about Anders Lassen for a Dane like yourself is that he just looms large in everything that's ever been said about Denmark in World War II. You know, more famous than the saving of the Jews. He's famous worldwide as he is. Is it easier researching a figure that's so well known, or harder because of dealing with all the misconceptions?
Well, there are lots of misconceptions, of course, in Denmark and abroad. And in some sense, it doesn't really make a difference for the research part, because most of the information I needed was actually not in Denmark. As you said, he spent only the first not many years of his life, and then he went abroad. And what he did abroad. So my research, I was helped a great deal by professional researchers, but that research took place in British archives, in German archives, in Italian archives, in Greek archives. So it wasn't a Danish story, except for the part which was to do with his family life, of course, his background, where he came from. And there I was fortunate enough to have access to his sister, who lives just a few hundred meters from where I live in Copenhagen, and I see her occasionally, and she was a great help and helped me get access to her mother's and Anders Lassen's mother's notebooks and letters and a lot of material, which got me started. But most of the research about the war I did outside of Denmark.
Well, brilliant stuff. Well, we can't wait to hear your results. So my guest has got his PowerPoint there. So what we're going to mostly do, folks, is do the questions at the end today. But if there are any particularly relating to a slide or particular detail that Thomas is sharing, please jump in. But I'm going to hand over to my guest now to share this remarkable story. So over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's the story of a young man, a man who was very young when the war began, and who was only 24 when he was killed in action just 1 month before the war ended in Italy. During the war, he accumulated 3 military crosses, and I've been told that he was one of only 24 British officers who received the military cross 3 times during the war. After his death, he was honored with the Victoria Cross for his actions in the last firefight, which cost him his life. So he is one of the most highly decorated, I suppose, Allied soldiers, and certainly the most highly decorated Danish soldier from World War II. He was one of only about 1,000 Danes who served in the Allied forces during the war, and he is by far the best known in Denmark and abroad. In some respects, I'd say that he is, as you also said, he's a legendary figure. He's a figure of myth. Some of you may have seen this film, which came out last year. I personally don't think it's a very good film, but it's interesting in the sense that it confirmed something which I'd been thinking for a long time, namely that Lassen has become a sort of mythical figure. A larger than life character. And by that I mean that to many people he seems to be a character actually outside of history, like King Arthur, or like the heroes and villains of the American West, or perhaps like the Homeric heroes. Actually, many of the British officers he met in Greece during the war, who had been more or less classically schooled, compared him to the Homeric heroes in their memoirs when they wrote about him. But he's become a sort of a character whom you can interpret in all sorts of ways and tell all sorts of stories about. And you can use him as a symbol for various things. In Denmark, he's a symbol of patriotism, he's a symbol of Danish fighting spirit, but to some Danes, he's also, by contrast, a symbol of how most Danes did not oppose the German occupation and of how the official Denmark, the Danish government, collaborated with the German occupier. So he's a sort of an embarrassing contrast to that. Now, I've got nothing against mythical figures, but what I wanted to do with my book was to take Lassen out of the realm of myth and put him back into history, where he lived and where he died. Also, I wanted to look at concepts like heroes and heroism. What does it take to be a hero? What is a hero? And also, there was a very good reason, which I think is a reason for writing almost any biography, that it's a way of exploring a different world. Or in this case, the various and very varied worlds which Lassen inhabited. He did so many different things in his short life, and many of those things I got occasion to explore and to tell about in my book. As I said, I wanted to take Lassen out of the sphere of myth and put him into the context of history. He was a man of flesh and blood. He was not a saint by no means, but he was not a killing machine, even though there are writers and people who like to call him that. Sometimes he was a gentleman, and sometimes, or rather very often, he was not. He could be very charming, and he could be extremely coarse and brutal. And he said things about women, about foreigners, about non-European people, and he did things which would not be acceptable to the sensibilities of today. And I should add, he said them and did them in ways which were noticed and remarked on by the men around him back then, which tells me that sometimes he went beyond what was acceptable even in his own time and in his own circle. But anyway, I had no desire when I began writing about Lassen and researching his life, I had no desire for his story to be in any particular way. I wasn't looking for a nice and kind Lassen or for a particularly hard or coarse or cruel Lassen. I was simply trying to find out what he was like, how he lived, what he did, under what sorts of conditions he did it, and not least, I wanted to find out why he did it and why he kept doing it for 5 years, and also what doing it did to him. Because there's no doubt, obviously, that the man who died outside a small Italian town called Comacchio on the 9th of April 1945 was by no means the same man who 5 years earlier had decided that now this was his war. And that basically is what my book is all about. It's also about, as I said, the different worlds of Anders Lassen, of being at sea in the early part of World War II, of the special operations executive, of that very strange and mysterious thing, which is the British military, of the various special forces, of all the private armies of World War II, of the war in Greece in 1943 and 45, and what I like to call the larger context, why it was not just exciting and interesting in a sort of micro way what one man like Lassen did or what the 200 men of the SBS did, but why it mattered to the larger context of the war. And that's what my book is about. My book came out in Danish in 2010. It's called Anders Lassens Krig, which means Anders Lassen's War. It's been in print ever since. It's now in its 5th edition. Every time there was a new edition, it's been expanded. It grew by about 40 or 50 pages between the 1st and the 5th edition, as I learned more along the way. The British or the English version, which is slightly shorter than the Danish one because I cut down on the Danish part of the story, came out in 2020, and the same year there was a Greek edition And this year, on occasion of the 80th anniversary of Lassen's death, the municipality of Comacchio decided to publish a special version of a comic book story
Mm.
by a very famous Italian artist, Hugo Pratt, in which Lassen features not as the main character, but as an important secondary character. And they asked me to write the accompanying text. So they produced a very small, beautiful little book with the Pratt's story in printed in color in Italian, and accompanying articles about the historical background and the topography of Lassen's last battle in English and in Italian. Lassen was born in 1920, and he spent most of his childhood and adolescence in on an estate called Bækkeskov, south of Copenhagen. He grew up in a landowning family, a family with a very strong military tradition and a very patriotic outlook. Lassen's sister Bente told me that, and I quote her, patriotism was in the air we breathed, along with the idea that one had a duty to lay down one's life for one's country in case of need. And Anders and his brother Franz grew up with a degree of freedom and autonomy, which I think would be very hard to imagine for present day parents. Anders and Franz spent as much time as possible in the woods around the family's home. And he was a great hunter. He was a crack shot with all sorts of guns and with homemade bows and arrows. And he was fast on his feet. He was strong and lean and fearless, sometimes reckless. And he developed from a very early age a great sense of terrain. He got very good at moving silently and invisibly and at making snap decisions. And the image here shows Franz shows Anders and his younger brother Franz. And Franz actually deserves a book all by himself. He joined Anders in England in 1942. He was recruited by the SOE as Anders had been. He participated in cross-channel raids like Anders did. And then later he was parachuted back into Denmark to work as an agent with the resistance. But Anders, and Anders is the one we are going to talk about this evening. Anders was intelligent and gifted in many ways, but not in the academic sort of way. He spent a couple of unhappy years at the exclusive public school Herlufsholm, which was the school his father had attended and the school which you attended if you were the son of a family like the Lassens. And then he finished his schooling at a local lower secondary school where he just barely managed to pass the final exams. He then spent just one term at a physical education academy and then he dropped out. And that left him, of course, with the question of what to do with himself now. He knew what he wanted to do. He wanted to own, he wrote to a friend once, he wanted to own a beautiful old estate and go hunting during the day and sit on the porch in the evening, sipping brandy, smoking cigars, and talking about the day's hunting. I mean, who wouldn't want that? But there was no way that would be possible, even though his mother belonged to the highest aristocracy in Denmark and his father was from a landowning family. They were not a particularly wealthy family. They lived on the royalties from his mother's books. His mother, Susanne, was a very talented and very popular writer of children's books. She was a great illustrator, and she kept the family financially afloat through her work. But there was not money enough to establish Anders in his own farm or get him started in a business, and he didn't have a mind for that sort of thing. So he didn't have very many choices. He could have chosen to do his national service, go into the army, but he wasn't really interested in being a soldier, which may be surprising given his later career. So he just postponed the military service. Instead, he went to sea as a cabin boy, not because he wanted to go to sea, but because that was the job he could get, or rather, that was the job his family's connections could get him. And he found the work of a sailor dull and dirty and without prospects, and he wrote as much in his letters home. He wrote, "Sailing is shit." But he must have gotten used to it somehow, because after an Easter holiday spent back home, he went to sea again, this time on a much larger, better and more modern ship, the Eleonora Maersk, which was, yes, a far better ship in all sorts of ways than the Phaeonia he had sailed on previously. And this time he seems to have enjoyed himself a bit more. He wrote lots of letters, and they tell of his pride in doing a good job. They also tell about how much fun he had when he went ashore, got drunk, got into fights, his visits to Brussels and all that sort of thing. But they are also, as I said, very much letters about his joy at being good at something, at being recognized as a man who could do a dangerous job well. And he obviously had, like most other people, I guess, and especially like most young people have, a need to be seen and to prove himself. Maybe particularly after his very unsuccessful school career, it was good to be somewhere where he could actually make himself useful.
Quick question
Also,
for you, Thomas. You
sure,
said
let
about
me
the
hear.
fact he joining, going to sea. Was
Right.
that was that a typical sort of thing to do in Denmark in that era for people who were like him? Because I tend to think about Denmark as being sort of, there's both like the sort of the academic side of things and banking and business, and I think of it as sort of farming. But if you're someone like him who's very physically active, was the sea a common thing for people like him in that era to go to do, or was there
Oh,
some other, tradition, if you like?
uh, well, I think given his family background, getting an ordinary working class job, I think, would be out of the question.
Right. Okay.
Uh, And Denmark is and was a seafaring nation. There were lots
Yeah.
of jobs at sea, so it wouldn't be that hard to get a job. Also, his family was connected to Prince Axel, a member of the royal family, who was chairman of the board of the East Asiatic Company, and he was also the CEO. And so he got little brother Franz an office job, and he got Anders a job on a ship.
Okay.
So there was that kind of access, but I guess even without Prince Axel's friendship, he could probably fairly easily have gotten a job on a ship. If
Okay.
that
Thank you.
was so, that was one way to go. But I was talking about his letters, which are also interesting because they seem to be completely without any kind of filter. He would write whatever came into his mind, whatever he thought was worth writing about, and he would tell the same stories and use the same kind of language, no matter whom he wrote to. Old school friends, his parents, or his grandmother, the Dowager Countess, the same kinds of stories. And stories which show intelligence, they show a sense of humor, a sense of irony, and also of self-irony. And he sailed with the Eleonora Maersk from May 1939 and then almost a year until April 1940, when Germany invaded Denmark. And with that, the first part of his life at sea ended. Because until then, until April 1940, the war seemed to be of no interest to Anders Lassen. From September 1939 to April 1940, he sailed during the war, but there's no mention of it, or almost none, in his letters. He doesn't write about Hitler, he doesn't mention Poland or democracy or the Jews or freedom. He just writes that sailing in war zones is interesting because it means he gets more pay. So he can drink brandy and smoke cigars instead of smoking self-rolled cigarettes and beer. But apart from that, the war didn't seem to interest him. But then on the 9th of April 1940, all of that changed when Germany invaded Denmark. That made him angry. very angry. It made it his war all of a sudden. His patriotism, in his background, made him want to go to war and do something about it. The war became a personal matter for him, and he joined a sort of mutiny on the Eleonora Maersk in the Persian Gulf, which forced the master of the ship to hand over the Eleonora Maersk to the British authorities in one of the ports in the Persian Gulf. And he then sailed under British flag from the 9th of April 1940 or thereabouts until October 1940, when he got himself a job on a tanker bound for Scotland from South Africa. But he enjoyed part of his time sailing on the Eleonora Maersk under British flag. He liked being trained to use the gun which was placed on board. He's the tall man with the white trousers we can see in the middle of the picture.
Mm-hmm.
And he noted in his diary that he was getting to be a really, really good gunner. And he was clearly proud of that. But then he got bored and he wanted not just to sail back and forth between the Persian Gulf and South Africa carrying oil and gas. He wanted to fight Germans. And so he got off the ship in South Africa, got on the tanker, British consul, and sailed to Scotland. He arrived in Scotland in December 1940 and was recruited by the Danish section of the Special Operations Executive. He spent a lot of time at various special training schools, learning the theory of sabotage and guerrilla work, and he didn't like that. He didn't like classrooms. He didn't like being taught by a teacher at a blackboard, but he did enjoy the paramilitary training at RAC House in Scotland, and he excelled at that. That was a bit like what he'd been doing as a boy in the woods around Bækkeskov hunting. Now he was just hunting men and not deer. But even though he was very good at all this paramilitary activity, he was not secret agent material. One of his superiors wrote about him, and I quote again, "He is keen enough on the job, but he cannot stand being kept in. He would definitely not be reliable enough for special duties. He might not keep sober when on leave, and he might give away secrets." So they couldn't use him as a secret agent. They couldn't parachute him into Denmark. And on the other hand, they couldn't use him for regimental duties either, because he wasn't fit to work within the bounds of a system. And then again, he was much too good to just be let go. They wanted to use him for something, and so it was decided to send him on to the Maid Honor Force. And the Maid Honor Force was one of the several private armies, as you might call them, or in this case, a private one-ship navy, set up mostly in the early part of the war by people with ideas and initiative and the right sort of connections. The Maid Honor Force was based on the Brixham cutter Maid Honor, which was bought by SOE funds by a man called Gustavus March-Phillipps, a racing driver, a novelist, an officer, adventurer, and a man of action and ideas. And March-Phillipps wanted to use the Maid Honor to land Aegeans on the shores of France, or carry out sabotage or ambush German naval vessels, and other interesting things like that. But none of that was allowed by the Royal Navy nor by the MI6. They didn't want amateurs making trouble in the Channel. So instead, the Maid Honor was sent, of all places, to Sierra Leone on the coast of West Africa, a British colony in West Africa. It was sent there to hunt for German radio stations or listening posts or U-boat bases or whatever else there might be there along the coast of West Africa. At least that was the idea. The voyage from Poole Harbor to Sierra Leone lasted approximately 40 days. Lassen was part of the 5-man crew manning the Maid Honor, and the rest of the Maid Honor force sailed more conventionally to Sierra Leone by steamer. Lassen's seamanship proved very valuable during these 40 days. But now, as it turned out, the SOE office in Lagos had no real use for the maid honor. They wrote to London, it's a very nice ship, but we really don't know what to do with it here in West Africa. But the men, the maid honor force, Lassen and his 15, 18 comrades proved to be very useful because the SOE people in Lagos were organizing something called Operation Postmaster, which was an operation to cut out, that is to steal, hijack a very large Italian passenger and cargo ship called the Duchessa d'Aosta and a smaller German ship called Licomba, which had sought refuge in the neutral Spanish port of Santa Isabel on the island of Fernando Po off the Cameroons. Now, in Guy Ritchie's film, the Duchessa d'Aosta was some sort of base ship for German submarines, which made it very important to neutralize it. That was not the case in real life, and the British did not think so. SOE Lagos came up with the idea, I think mainly because the target was there and the operation seemed like something that could be done, and it would most of all prove the usefulness and capabilities of the SOE. Now, the taking of the Duchessa d'Aosta is a wonderful story. It's a great story. There's comedy, there's spies, and nobody gets badly hurt. And I tell it in some detail in my book, but we don't really have time for that here. I just need to say that Lassen distinguished himself very much during that operation. His seamanship actually saved one of the tugboats carrying the postmaster force from Lagos to Fernando Po from going under in a storm. He distinguished himself so much, actually, that March-Phillipps decided to promote him and make him lieutenant on the spot, on the deck of one of the tugboats. March-Phillipps had no authority to do so, but he did it anyway, and the promotion was confirmed when they got back to London eventually. Before getting back to England, Lassen spent some time in Nigeria, where he worked with an SOE officer training local tribesmen in guerrilla warfare. Lassen enjoyed the freedom, he enjoyed the hunting, he enjoyed the autonomy, but after a while he got bored and he got frustrated because there were no Germans to kill. And that was actually, I mean, that was what he wanted to do in the war. He wanted to kill the bastards, as he wrote. And so he decided that although he was actually in the process of buying a wife for some gin and a sum of money, he decided that he would accept a posting back in Britain and rejoin March-Phillipps and his force. And March-Phillipps' maid honor force had meanwhile turned into a thing called the small-scale raiding force, which throughout 1942 carried out reconnaissance, intelligence, and deception raids across the Channel. They hit the north coast of France and the Channel Islands, which were occupied by the Germans. And later, maid honor force, it turned us into the small-scale raiding force, which became the number 62 Commando. And the purpose of all this activity was to show that Britain was still fighting, that Britain was actively in the war. It was also to carry out reconnaissance of the beaches in preparation for an invasion that might come someday. It was to gather intelligence, steal German code books, take prisoners for interrogation and all that sort of thing. But mainly, perhaps, it was a matter of deception. It was a way of keeping the Germans nervous, to making the Germans believe that something great and very dangerous would happen very soon in northern France, to cover for Operation Torch in November 1942 in North Africa, and to attract German forces to France, German forces that might otherwise have gone to the Eastern Front.
Just interrupt for a second, Thomas. It's that era of it really doesn't matter what you do as long as you do something.
As long as you do something.
And sort of setting up the teams and kind of getting the concept worked out. And then later on in the war, the concept of raiding and commandos and missions becomes a little bit more settled. But 41, 42, it's just sort of a trial and error, learning on the job, building up trust, building up teams. And it seems now in some ways, as you say, the results of the missions were sometimes fairly insignificant, but the concept is being developed. That's the point.
I think that the main result of those raids was deception.
Yeah.
It was sort of underpinning the fantasy that something dangerous would be happening in northern France very soon. And that was extremely important. But whether they killed 1 German or 10 Germans or took 2 German prisoners or 5 German prisoners or blew up a German observation post, that mattered less. I mean, it doesn't make it less dangerous, or it doesn't make them less courageous. But I think the point of their mission was probably not known to themselves. They genuinely believed that it was very important to destroy this or that German observation post or take the Germans prisoner. But what really mattered was to show the Germans that something would happen here, something which didn't happen for a very long time. But Lassen proved himself very active and very resourceful and very courageous. And during one of these raids, he killed a man for the very first time. He made a note of it in his diary, the same sort of note he made when, as a boy, he killed pigeons or deer or hare in the woods around Bækkeskov. In December 1942, he got his first military cross for his participation in Operation Postmaster and the Channel Islands. The wording of the motivation for that decoration is very vague, because the operations he took part in were not something you could speak very clearly about, very openly. But he was so good at what he did that in early 1943, Lassen and another officer were sent to Egypt to help David Sterling, the commander of the SAS, to set up a seaborne squadron of the Special Air Service. For some reason, David Sterling had decided that the Special Air Service needed a seaborne wing to carry out amphibious operations along the coast of North Africa. But just before Lassen and his comrade arrived in Egypt, Sterling was taken prisoner by the Germans, which resulted in a crisis for the SAS. The SAS sort of exploded or disintegrated into its various component parts, and the seaborne squadron broke out and became an autonomous unit, the Special Boat Squadron, which later became the Special Boat Service, commanded by George Jellicoe, with the Scottish officer David Sutherland as his second in command. 2 really remarkable officers, and I'd like you to notice their age. George Jellicoe was just 2 years older than Lassen, and David Sutherland was the same age as Lassen. So it was a time when young men got tremendous responsibility and tremendous possibilities of acting autonomously at a very young age. The first major operation of the new Special Boat Squadron was an attack on 3 different German airfields on Crete. The raiders were landed from the sea on the south coast of Crete and marched across the mountains to their respective targets. And those of you who know Crete will know that those are very serious mountains. They are very high and they are very rough, and in June and July it gets very dry and very hot. It was very hard going. Lassen led the attack on Castelli Pediada, the easternmost of the 3 airfields, and this was the most dramatic of the 3 attacks, as he, Lassen, and his men got into a violent firefight with German and Italian guards. None of the 3 patrols succeeded in doing any real significant damage. Lassen believed that his attack had destroyed 8 German planes, but actually it had just damaged a single one. But again, the whole point of the operation was mostly deception. because together with a similar operation on Sardinia and other deception work, Operation Mincemeat, for instance, it all served to mask the invasion of Sicily, which took place in early July 1943. So the purpose was to make the Germans wall-eyed, as it were, making them look at the two ends of the Mediterranean instead of looking where they should be looking, at Sicily. For this operation, Lassen received his second military cross, and in September 1943, he was promoted captain. And again, we should remember, Lassen had no kind of formal military training. He had done the paramilitary SOE training in Scotland, but otherwise he had learned what he knew about soldiering on the job. On the 25th of July 1943, Mussolini was removed from power, and on the 8th of September, Italy capitulated. Britain tried to secure the Italian islands in the Aegean before the Germans could do so, but unsuccessfully because they did not have sufficient forces. So the British were forced out of the Aegean back to the island of Castellorizo at the far eastern end of the map here, and back all the way to Cyprus. There were some notable battles during the Aegean campaign at Simi and Leros and Samos, and in all three cases the SBS ended up fighting defensive battles as infantry, not what they were trained for and not what their mindset suited them for. Lassen distinguished himself particularly on Simi, where the SBS and some Italian troops fought off a German force which had landed on the island looking for Greek resistance fighters and men from the long-range desert group, which they believed to be on the island. Lassen was involved in very close combat, probably hand-to-hand using his knife, and he showed exceptional courage and speed, endurance, determination, and his commanding officer wrote that Lassen had, and I quote, an exceptional ability to read the terrain. He had an instinct for this kind of small-scale fighting. Lassen got his third MC for gallantry on Simi, and as I said, that made him one of only 24 officers getting the Military Cross 3 times during World War II. After the unsuccessful attempt to capture the Aegean Islands, the SBS finally came into their own as raiders. They now began waging guerrilla warfare against the Germans on the islands, and that was what they did best. And that was what Lassen did best, and what he seemed to enjoy the most. The job was primarily to gather intelligence, but also to carry out sabotage and espionage, to help escaped prisoners of war or downed Royal Air Force pilots to cooperate with the resistance, and once again, deception to make sure that the Germans believed that something dramatic would happen in Greece, so they would keep troops on as many of the islands as possible, where the Royal Navy would then make it very hard for them to get away and do more useful things elsewhere. To carry out this work, the Special Boat Service were aided by the Levant Schooner Flotilla, a small fleet of Greek schooners based on the coast of neutral Turkey and based in a larger ship called the Tewfik, which was a kind of mobile base which moved up and down the coast of neutral Turkey. The transport itself into the islands was provided by the Levant Schooner Flotilla. And these small craft were disguised as Greek fishing boats or merchant boats and so forth. I don't know if you can see it, but the boat on the left of the image flies the white ensign at the top of the mast. That's probably because the photo was taken by a Royal Navy photographer. Otherwise, they would fly no flag at all. They might fly a Greek flag from time to time. They might try a German flag. They would try all kinds of deceptions. I think the British flag was simply there for the sake of the photographer. One of the many pleasures of researching this book was getting to know by correspondent Dick Holmes, who is the tall gentleman with the Thompson submachine gun in the picture. Next to him is Doc Pumford, a boxer from London, two remarkable men from the Special Boat Service. And Dick Holmes wrote to me from Canada, where he lived, that he didn't really like Lassen. He described himself and his comrades in the SBS as a bunch of arrogant bastards. He said, we knew that we were superior to our enemies and, he said, to other British forces. They were motivated by a strong comradeship, a sense of being different from the rest of the army. Dick Holmes didn't write to me about patriotism, and I haven't read much about patriotism as a motivating factor among the British SBS men. There was a war to be fought, there was a war to be won, there were some Germans who were out to kill them, and so they had to kill the German. That was fairly simple. There was a job to be done. I think Lassen was motivated strongly by patriotism and by a strong hatred of the Germans, which his British friends noticed and found a little bit disturbing sometimes, his eagerness to kill Germans. Lassen was a popular leader, but as I said, Holmes did not like him. Lassen said to me, or wrote to me, maybe we didn't get along because Lassen was the only man in the SBS who was even more arrogant than myself. But Holmes did acknowledge that even though Lassen was short-tempered and violent and hated being told off by his superiors and sometimes would take it out violently on his own men when somebody said to him and a superior told him off, he was also fiercely loyal to his men, and he was extremely brave. He would always lead from the front. He would not ask people to do anything that he could not do himself, except perhaps them carrying his own kit, which he did not enjoy doing. In August 1944, the SBS briefly deployed to Bari in southern Italy to carry out missions in Croatia. By that time, and this was after D-Day, there wasn't so much of a need to make the Germans believe that something would happen in Greece. I mean, that was too late now. It had happened in France. Now it was a matter of keeping the Germans in Greece by making it difficult to get out, by sabotaging railways and roads in the Balkans. And Lassen led an operation near Dubrovnik, where his force blew up a railway bridge, and he then got into a fierce fight with Croatian fascist forces while retreating across the mountains to get back to the coast. Lassen's patrol lost one man, but managed to get back to the coast and were picked up by a patrol boat and taken back to Italy. And on this map, you should notice the town of Comacchio up near the top of Italy, just south of Venice. That's going to be an important place in a short while. In October 1944, Lassen was promoted major. And during that autumn, Lassen and his SBS unit returned to Greece, now spearheading the British advance north through Greece, carrying out reconnaissance and making contact with local partisans. The Germans were now pulling out, and the job of the SBS was to slow them down and to try to establish a British military presence in the void the Germans left behind. And also to bluff, to make the communist partisans in Greece believe that a great British landing would take place in northern Greece, and thereby discouraging any ideas that the Russians might have of entering Greece from Bulgaria. Lassen's Greek interpreter, Jason Mavrikis, later described this part of their job as the Great Bluff. Lassen led the first small British force to enter Thessaloniki as the Germans were leaving the city. The Greek partisans were already well established in the city, but Lassen's force was the first British military presence in Thessaloniki, and they remained there until a larger force could move in and take over control of the city together with the Greek partisans. During the winter of 1944-45, Lassen found himself doing a job which he was in no way suited for and which he did not enjoy. He was put in charge after a period of leave in Athens of a makeshift force named Sen Force, Sen for Lassen, which was sent to Crete, where the 12,000 German troops on the island had retreated into fortified positions in the northwestern end of Crete. Sen Force's job now was to keep the Germans in place, to protect the SOE missions on Crete, and to keep the various Greek factions from fighting, especially to keep the communists from grabbing power. And this was a political, a diplomatic and policing role for which Lassen and his men had no training at all, and for which Lassen himself was ill-suited by temperament. He was a man of action, he was not a negotiator, and he and his men fought themselves caught between opposing factions, and they had the very unpleasant experience of being seen as the enemy by many local Greeks. It was a very unhappy time for the SBS and for Lassen, and what we see in the picture is Lassen at the Lassen in an uncharacteristically clean and orderly uniform during the funeral of a British officer who was killed by communist partisans on Crete. Now, Lassen and his men were pleased when they were moved out of Crete and deployed back to Italy, and when they were allowed to revert to a raiding role. They were now needed in a scouting and supporting role to assist the Eighth Army's advance along the east coast of Italy. The green line across the map is the Gothic line, and the far eastern end of it is the Genghis Khan line, which was the long line of German positions which held back the Allied advance. And in early 45, the Allies were getting ready to break through, to move north across the Po Plain and get all the way up to Trieste. For the British, and the Brenner Pass for the Americans. And to do that, the British Eighth Army had to move through a small strip of land close to Lake Comacchio on the far eastern end of the German defensive line. And that's where Lassen and the SBS were needed for reconnaissance and various support work. This is a map of Lake Comacchio, and you can see some dark areas along the lake and inland, which are flooded areas. The Germans had blown up dikes and dams and pumping station, and the low country had been flooded to make the Allied advance more difficult, creating very narrow corridors which the Allies had to move through. And the Allies now deployed the Eighth Army now deployed the SBS on the southern coast of Lake Comacchio in order to carry out reconnaissance on the lake, measure the depth of the lake between 60 centimeters and 2 meters, to work out where it would be possible to use amphibious vehicles to attack the German forces along the coast of the lake, and also to carry out reconnaissance and deception work along the lake. The idea was to make the Germans believe that the Eighth Army would attack along the very narrow strip of land between the lake and the Adriatic Sea to the far east of the map, instead of further inland where the attack actually was to come. And here, just to give you an idea of the kind of landscape the Eighth Army would be moving through, and you see these curious amphibious vehicles, the buffaloes or the fantails, which were used in great numbers to move across the lake. It turned out they were not really suited for it. They were much too tall, and the water was too shallow, so they would mostly be above water and make very easy targets for the Germans. It was very difficult to move around in the lake. It was more useful to use storm boats and assault boats, but you couldn't carry very large numbers of troops in them. You could carry smaller patrols of SBS men who would attack the German positions on the far side of the lake, as I said, to carry out reconnaissance or to keep the Germans nervous, make them believe that something dangerous would happen along the Adriatic coast and not inland. And here we have a group of Italian fishermen, some of them, I suppose, poachers, some regular fishermen, some of them partisans who would help the SBS with their reconnaissance and help them maneuver these flat-bottomed boats, a bit like punts, around the lake. And the color images are watercolors by Hugo Pratt from the new book I told you about. Hugo Pratt was extremely fascinated by Lassen and by the SBS, and apart from the comic book story, he made a series of very beautiful watercolors of events around Lake Comacchio. I think they're very atmospheric. Now, Lassen's last operation was an operation called Operation Fry. It took place between the 8th and 9th of April. Lassen's patrol had occupied 4 small islands in the middle of Lake Comacchio, the ones marked 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the map. 1 and 2 were occupied by Lassen and his men, the British SBS, and 3 and 4 further to the west were occupied by Italian partisans who worked with the Special Boat Service. And from there, they carried out raids on the north coast of the lake, attacking German positions, and on the east coast along the small or the narrow strip of land which the British called the Spit, which divides the lake from the Adriatic Sea. And they carried out their last attack in the night between the 8th and 9th of April. You can see a cross near the top of the map. That's the landing point. The idea was to set a patrol ashore, 18 men led by Lassen, move towards Comacchio, get into the town of Comacchio, make noise, take some Germans prisoners, kill as many as possible, get out again with the prisoners for interrogation, of course, and again with the main purpose of making the Germans believe that something drastic would happen along the Spit far to the east of where the real attack was going to take place inland through the Argenta corridor. While waiting to carry out this operation, the SBS men and the partisans spent the days lying low, literally, on the small flat islands, 1, 2, 3, 4. You see one of them on the photo. A hut used by fishermen or game wardens, which has been shot to pieces by German artillery on the north coast, which had the range and were ready to shoot at anything that moved on the islands. The Germans had observation posts in the belfry of the Cathedral of Comacchio and in a couple of other towers, and anything that moved could be seen. So they would spend the days lying in shallow holes covered by twigs, eaten by mosquitoes, and they would get up only in darkness. And they got up in the early part of the night of between the 8th and the 9th of April and sailed in their storm boats and flat-bottomed fishermen's boats to across the lake through a hard wind up to a point which must have looked very much like this. We have Comacchio in the background. We can see the church, the belfry, and we have a causeway here with telegraph, telephone poles, and then we have a sort of canal, some water on the left, and then again a strip of land. So the boats would have hit the strip of land on the left side of the picture. They would have crossed that land in the darkness, scrambling through mud in a country which had not been properly checked out. They had wanted to carry out reconnaissance but couldn't get there because of a headwind the night before, so they didn't really know where they were landing. But somehow they got across that first strip of land, then got into the water again. We don't know whether they could wade across, whether the water was shallow enough for that, or whether they had to carry their boats across and then sail across this little bit of water and then get onto the causeway and move in towards Comacchio. If we move back a little bit away from Comacchio, the landscape will have looked like this. This photo was taken shortly after the events. The map on the left was drawn by Jørgen Halk, a Danish captain of the South African army, an intelligence officer, so he knew how to draw maps based on information gathered from the SBS shortly after the events. And we have the arrow showing the spot where Lassen and his men landed, and we have the causeway, and then we have, it says oversvømmet areal, meaning flooded land. And that's what we see here on the right. We have the causeway, we can see some railway tracks, and we can see German pillboxes, one behind the other. There must have been a third one just beyond the left side of the picture frame, and we can see again more water on the right side. So once you got on the causeway, you were sort of caught between water on both sides, and you could just move forward toward Comacchio. We can see again the church tower and a few other towers at the back. So Lassen and his men got on the causeway, moved towards Comacchio, and a German sentry shouted at them. Lassen sent one of his men forward, a man who knew a little bit of Italian. He tried to make believe that they were actually Italian fishermen returning home from a fishing expedition. The Germans did not believe them. They opened fire from one of the pillboxes, and some of the SBS men were hit, some were killed, some were wounded, and they sort of took cover on the two sides of the causeway. Lassen got up, he blew his whistle, World War I style, shouted, "Move forward, you bastards," and he moved forward himself. He stormed the pillbox, threw hand grenades into it. He was known as a man who could throw fast and far and very precisely. He shot at it with his submachine gun and took prisoners the two surviving Germans. They came out, he sent them back towards where the boats were waiting with the Italian fishermen, and then moved on towards the next pillbox, which opened fire. And the same thing happened once again. And when Lassen and his men were moving towards the third pillbox, the Germans made signs or shouted "Kamerad" and sort of signified that they wanted to surrender. But as Lassen moved closer, somebody somewhere opened fire, and he was hit somewhere between the groin and the chest, fell to the ground. One of his men, Leslie Stevenson, went up to him and tried to lift him, but Lassen was a big man and he was carrying equipment, and he had gotten entangled in some telephone wire and couldn't be moved. And he said something like, "I'm done for." And then he either said, there are two versions, he either said, "Carry on the attack," or he said, "Break off the attack." In any case, his second in command decided that now the Germans, of course, knew they were there. The sky must have been ablaze with white rockets and light, and there were machine guns firing from everywhere. We don't know where the bullet that hit Lassen came from. It may have come from the pillbox in front of him. It may have come from somewhere entirely different. There's no way of knowing that. So Lassen and the other wounded men were left behind in the hope that they would find their way back to the boats and get back to base, and the dead were left where they were lying, and the survivors left the scene. And in a way, they had accomplished what they came for, to make noise and to be seen and contribute to the idea that the attack would come on the eastern edge of the lake. This, by the way, is what the lake looked like on the evening of the 9th of April this year. I was there for the commemoration, the 80th anniversary of Lassen's death. We have Comacchio at the far background. We have the sort of canal on the left, which Lassen and his men must have crossed to get from the first strip of land onto the causeway. And my son and a documentarist who hopes to make a documentary on Lassen are pointing their camera towards I don't know what, and looking a bit like the SBS men may have been doing back then. This is the base island, island number 1 or 2, the morning after Lassen's death, when news came back that Lassen had been left behind, probably dead. It was a shocking piece of news to his comrades. They tended to believe, as David Sutherland wrote later, that Lassen was indestructible. He had been through so many things, and they had all been through so much that it seemed almost impossible and almost unbearable that he had been killed. But he had, of course, and the war went on, and the attack through the Argenta Gap took its course and was carried out more or less as planned. It took a bit longer than planned, but the British and the Allies managed to break through between the Lake Comacchio and the flooded areas inland, and the Americans broke through the German defenses further to the west. The town of Argenta was practically destroyed. Heavy bombers were used as artillery before the attack, and not much was left of Argenta. The day after the fighting, Lassen's body and those of 2 of the 4 SBS men who had died that night were picked up by a local priest and some women from Comacchio, who carried the bodies into Comacchio and buried them in the old cemetery of the town, which had been closed down by Napoleon in the early 1800s, but had been taken into use again during the war because the new cemetery outside of the town could not be reached because of flooding and fighting, and so they used the old cemetery in town. And here we see their makeshift graves. Lassen's grave is the center, and 2 of his comrades are buried next to him. The 4th man was found only later and buried where he fell. Today, the old cemetery is part of the schoolyard of a primary school in Comacchio. The nuns who run the school were very interested when we showed up and told them what had happened in their schoolyard 80 years ago, and allowed us to take pictures. And one of them remembered that actually a gardener had dug up bones when he tended the garden many years previously, but not those of Lassen or his men, because they had been moved to a different place. But we'll get back to that in a short while. Now, David Sutherland, who had taken over command of the SBS when George Jellicoe went on to Staff College, was so shocked by Lassen's death, and he had admired and liked Lassen so much that he began collecting eyewitness accounts of the events the night between the 8th and 9th of April, and wrote a recommendation securing the necessary signatures from his superiors. And shortly after VE Day, he got in his jeep down in Italy and drove up to Klagenfurt to 8th Army headquarters to present the case for a Victoria Cross for Lassen. That was not without difficulties, because Lassen was a foreigner and because special forces were not all that popular in Whitehall. But Sutherland managed to get his case across, and and Lassen got his Victoria Cross. And as we see here, in December 1945, Emil Lassen, the man in the greatcoat and hat, Susanne with the fur, and Lassen's younger sister Bente visited Buckingham Palace to receive the Victoria Cross from King George. Susanne, who, as I said, was a very talented and very popular writer and illustrator of children's books, advertised in British newspapers to get in touch with people who had known her son during the war. She got a lot of reactions. And so she traveled to Italy in 1945. She traveled with Bente, her 14, 15-year-old daughter. She visited the places where Anders had fought, and she talked to people who had met him in Italy and in Greece. And she collected a lot of material, which she used to write a book, which was published in Danish in 1949 and in English in 1962. It's a fine and moving book which contributed a great deal to creating the lasting interest in her son. And now the last picture I want to show you was taken on April 9th, 2025. That is a couple of months ago. The left one is Anders Lassen's grave at the Argenta Gap War Cemetery, where Lassen is buried together with a bit more 600 and I believe 25 other Commonwealth soldiers who died in that area. And if you could read the wording on the reed, you will see that there reads from the Danish Naval and Army Special Forces, from the British SAS and SBS who were present, from the Danish Home Guard, and from the town of Comacchio. And on the right over on the other side, we have a monument which was inaugurated by the city of Comacchio in 2002, a monument to Lassen, Edwards, Roberts, and Hughes, the four men who were killed between the 8th and 9th of April 2025. And that monument, together with monuments to various partisans who died in the area and to a Royal Marine, Thomas Peck Hunter, who also won a posthumous Victoria Cross close to Comacchio, are very important places, places of memory, sites of memory for Comacchio. And wreaths are led there and speeches are made on anniversaries of the liberation and the various battles. And over here we see two Italian gendarmes, two carabinieri, in full dress uniform, and we have a large wreath from the municipality of Comacchio, and again we have wreaths from the Danish Special Forces, the SBS, SAS, and so forth. And that was my little presentation. If you have any questions or any comments, I'd be very happy to hear them and see if I can answer.
Well, I mean, brilliant stuff, Thomas. Absolutely amazing stuff. So there were a couple of comments towards the end there about the the causeway and the spit there and the battle there. And in your considered opinion, at that point of the war, when you get these sorts of legendary soldiers, does their assessment of risks get a bit worn out? Do they start believing a little bit in their own immortality and invincibility? You know, you said about the surprise among fellow troopers and soldiers that he'd been killed. Do you think if you've been on so many missions, you do start believing that you're never gonna get killed and you take greater risks?
Well, of course, there's no way of knowing what went on in Lassen's head. But I mean, young people, and Lassen was young. He was not 25 when he died. Young people are known to have a sense of invincibility and of just that they can do anything. I mean, that's why they make good soldiers, and why they. But of course, Lassen was also a very experienced soldier. He had been in situations like this one or similar situations many times before, and he I don't know. I honestly don't know. He may have had a sort of a heightened sense of his own invincibility, but he also had a very, very strong sense of needing to get the job done, of sacrificing himself if necessary. He may have known that he could easily get killed doing this, but he will have chosen to do it anyway because it had to be done.
No, that's fair enough. And the other thing is that obviously the type of missions he was involved in evolved over the course of the years, from that beginning phase of it just being doing something, and then there's deception, and there's sort of the actual raiding, then there's more scouting. Do you think from his did he carry on writing letters during that era, or did the letters dry up a bit?
Unfortunately not. He wrote a lot of letters when he was a sailor because it was easy or fairly easy to send them. He wrote practically no letters after joining the SOE. A few letters arrived through Sweden and a couple of Red Cross postcards, but practically nothing. He wrote one important letter in the autumn of 1943, just after the Danish government had officially broken off its cooperation with the Germans. Right. He wrote a letter to the Danish ambassador in London, who was a friend of the family. And he wrote to him because he could send a letter through British army channels from Italy, Greece, wherever he was, to London. And he wrote to him that he was extremely happy that Denmark was now officially not cooperating with the Germans. For the first time in the war, he felt that he wasn't just fighting for himself, he was now fighting for Denmark. But apart from that, I don't know that he wrote any letters that reached Denmark, apart from a very few ones from England. And he didn't write a diary. He left his diary with a friend, a young woman in London when he left for Egypt. And as far as we know, he didn't write anything down, at least nothing that has come down to us.
Okay, thank you. So people are asking about the mythologizing of his story. Obviously a very courageous man, but do you think there was a reason to bring his story to the forefront, very early on? Because some of these heroes we write about, their stories weren't known till the 1970s and 80s when people rediscovered them. But his, you mentioned his mother's book there. His was known during the war, immediately after the war, and arguably has never not been out of the public awareness since he died. But do you feel there was a reason to kind of create a Danish hero within Denmark?
In Denmark, certainly. In Denmark, certainly. I mean, in Britain, getting a Victoria Cross makes you something very special, but he was not the only British Victoria Cross winner. So in that sense, yes, he was exceptional, but he was one out of a number of people who had done similar things in a British context. But in a Danish context, he was absolutely unique. He was the official Danish war hero. And of course, it helped making him so that his mother was the very talented and well-connected writer she was, and she was able to write a book about him shortly after the war. His family was well known in Denmark. His father was, his mother was as a writer. So it was very easy to tell the story. It was very easy to get people interested. And Jørgen Halk, the South African Danish officer I mentioned, the guy who drew the map of Lassen's landing place, was also a writer and a poet. And he talked about Lassen on Danish radio as early as, I think, 1947, and he published a very short little book about him and some articles in the newspapers. And Danish media and the Danish public were extremely hungry for stories of Danish heroes, resistance heroes and military heroes. There was an endless demand for that kind of stories in Denmark. And Lassen's story was so exceptional, it made people proud in Denmark.
No, thank you for that. And I think my last kind of comment really is about, I suppose, the danger of trying to paint these sorts of people with a very narrow brush. Trying summing up someone like Paddy Mayne or Anders Lassen or Guy Gibson or any of these Ord Wingett with a couple of sentences is always going to be problematic, because clearly alongside this this lethality he had. He had this, clearly had this ability to use the terrain, use the ground. Very, very good shot. Very, very good at that military skill set. But as you say, maybe didn't know how to say different things, different people. Maybe not so good at keeping his mouth shut sometimes. Maybe opinionated, a bit difficult to. Some people liked him, some people didn't like him. These people need to be drawn out. They need books. They need thorough investigations. The minute you start saying, well, he was a guy who did this with a bow and arrow, it's too simplistic, isn't it?
It is. And I think he deserves to be seen as a real life person.
Yeah.
He deserves better than just being a sort of empty outline where people can draw whatever they want inside. Where Guy Ritchie can make his film, or anybody can. I mean, that's allowed, of course, but he deserves being seen and being shown as a real human being. He's not superhuman. He is a human being who did some really, really exceptional things and kept doing them for 5 years.
Yeah,
that's worth writing a book about. It makes him it makes him deserving of being shown as a complete person.
Yeah.
A flawed person, but a complete person.
As you said at the beginning, he did die frightfully young, but at the same time, in the 5 years he was fighting for his country and fighting for the Allied cause, I mean, he lived more lifetimes than you, me, and most people watching this combined times 10. He traveled the world. He got to see the progression of the war from being the countries dropping like dominoes in Europe and the Nazis having the upper hand to the eventual, he didn't quite see the victory, but he got close to the, he must have realized that, the Nazis were all but beaten. The war was coming to an end. It was the final push to go. So, his life was short, but it burned very brightly. And I think, that's it.
And in a way, he was lucky, not because he died young, but he was lucky because there was a war where he could make something of himself. He was a young man who would have had difficulties, I think, finding a place for himself in peacetime Denmark.
Yes.
But then suddenly a war came along, and there was a great demand for things which he could do really, really well.
Yeah.
He was extremely brave, and he was very good at a special kind of soldiering. And he was asked to do difficult and dangerous things, and he did them well and was rewarded for them, which must have been gratifying for himself, finding something that he could do really, really well, something which was meaningful.
Yeah.
So to him, like to a lot of other people like him, the war was a window of opportunity.
Yeah. I'm sure. I think
it came with enormous costs, of course. I mean, he was physically much affected, and I'm sure that it damaged him, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But he was also lucky in finding a place where there was a demand for what he was and what he could do.
And I think you said it yourself there. The biggest battle he would have faced would have been the transition from military life back to civilian life. You just can't imagine him, opening up a shop in Copenhagen and selling tobacco or something, or I can't possibly predict whether he would or wouldn't have adapted, but that would have been a big battle, that to go away from
farming in Rhodesia, maybe.
Yeah, he would have, whatever he'd have done, it would have been a fascinating story. Well, Thomas, it's been extraordinary talking to you. Anyone who has any doubt about who he was as an individual now has all the information there. The detail about the various actions was fantastic. So, folks, the link to the book is in the description below, or you can find it at your favorite bookstore or wherever you buy your books. Tomorrow, we have another show with another Danish historian looking at two Danish soldiers who didn't know each other, but both ended up fighting with the Canadians in Northwest Europe. I'm looking forward to that one. So, as always, click like and subscribe. Buy my guest books. Thank you for the questions and comments. I will see you all again tomorrow. Cheers, everybody. Bye.